let me tell you a few things about my interest in Dickens and how I got there. I'm a Shakespearean, not 19th century, and so I'm here as the setup man, I guess, to provide post holes for other people to put their scholarship in. So one of the things that I'm going to do is simply to give you an overview of Dickens, his work, and his reputation. But when I was doing this, I sort of got sidetracked because I began to realize that Dickens is more than an author. Dickens is an institution. Dickens is a cottage industry. And that interested me because so was Shakespeare. A lot of people criticize Stratford, England, for having made such a big deal of William Shakespeare, and to say that Shakespeare is also not just a writer, but he's become this great institutional thing. And I think the same thing is true of Dickens. The only other writer that I think of immediately would be Mark Twain, who became a kind of an institution, and like Charles Dickens, had a major role in making himself an institution that people still respond to, if you will. I'm not sure whether there is another room up above us, but if not, then this is the room that was the children's library when I'm a lifelong resident of Rock Island. And this was the children's library, and I spent a lot of time here. I spent enough time here that I can actually tell you this is where the Barbara the Elephant books were. Over here was action biographies on Kit Carson and the Baby Crockett. Right here was Thornton Burgess books, which I adored. And over there, when I got a little bit bigger, was Anne of Green Gables and Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm. I can still, when I walk into this room and it's empty, it seems like a great empty mouth, because when I was here, it was full of friends. I used to spend sometimes Saturday mornings when my mother got my sister and me out of her hair and dumped us off at the library, and we spent our time absolutely having a wonderful time right here. I first met Dickens, however, not in this library, but in a series of books that maybe some of you know of, Olive Beaupre Miller's The Book House. How many people have ever even heard of Olive Beaupre Miller and The Book House? Good. I'm surprised because we're all about the right age to know The Book House, and they were sold up in Chicago, and I don't want to say anything more about that. But one of the things that Olive Beaupre Miller did was to summarize an important section of the Copperfield books. And I read those for the first time in a volume, which was part of the set, which was, the volume was called Up Fairy Stairs or something like that. And I was enjoying them all. When I came to David Copperfield, it was too boyish for me. I never quite liked it, and so Dickens was gone for me for a while because he didn't have the kinds of things as a little girl I was interested in at that point. Then I went through, forgive me for doing this sort of little bit of remembrance of how I got to Dickens, but it's actually going to connect to something that I'm going to do at the end. After my first initial bad experience with Dickens, I spent summers in my high school years and my early college years just reading all sorts of novels in the summer, and everything that was canonical that you could ever imagine. And that was where I began reading more things, the Oliver Twist, and the kinds of things, Great Expectations, that you would expect. When I went to college, Dickens was not mentioned. I do not believe that any Dickens work was taught at all when I was in college. And when I went to graduate school and took 19th century novels, we read Dickens, but we read Bleak House. Now, I don't know if you have ever heard of Bleak House, but if you're starting Dickens, don't start with Bleak House. First of all, it's that big. And secondly, it has to do, I think I'm supposed to be talking into this. Can you hear me? Okay. It has to do with the Chancery Courts in England, where Dickens actually did quite a lot about that. And he spent, just pages and pages explaining how things were done in the Chancery Court, and it's just much too much detail, I think, for most people. The problem with the Chancery Court was that it took so long to get a suit through the courts that people kept dying out before their thing actually came and became part of what were resolved. So we read Bleak House, and it was a challenge to get through it. And I was rushing with graduate school, and so I don't have very much of a memory of Bleak House, but I've never been sort of inclined to try it again, but maybe in retirement, that's what I'll do. What I want to do, then, one more step in this. When I came back to Augustana, there was, to my memory, and Roll can check me on this, but I don't remember seeing many people who were interested in teaching Dickens in the years that I was Augustana, since I've been there for 45 years now. That's a lot of time, and I just do not remember many courses that had Dickens as a figure. So when I went to do this, I took one of my classes that had a fair number of kids in it, and I said to them, do you know who Dickens is? And I got these indignant, of course we know who Dickens is. So then I said, do you know, ever heard of Oliver Twist? Oh, no. Have you ever heard of David Copperfield? Yes. What about Christmas Carol? Yeah. And then I said, how many of you have read a book by Dickens? And out of 25 people, I got 4. Now these are English major types, but I got absolutely 4. And when I checked on it, turned out that all 4 of them had read Oliver Twist after they had seen the musical. There is something interesting going on here, and I want to pursue that in a little minute. But I want to, first of all, just tell you some very basic things about Charles Dickens. He was born in 1812, and that's one of those dates that I know because of the War of 1812, although I can never remember what England and the United States were fighting about. I know that there was a war then. At that same time, Napoleon was invading Russia. So that's the kind of stuff that was going on when Dickens was born. His father was a Navy clerk, and he was, I don't think he was exactly a ne'er-do-well because he had lots of different jobs, but he doesn't ever seem to have been able to handle what came in relation to what went out. And he spent a lot of time in debt. And in 19th century England, if you were in debt, it meant very often you were in prison. And in fact, his father was imprisoned at the Marshalsea prison. It was one of those things, you're in prison until you can pay your debt, but you can't pay your debt until you can get out if it's just catch 22, kind of situation. When somebody was in prison at that time, they sometimes brought the family with them. I mean, that was just part of the way the prison system worked. And so he brought Dickens' father brought his wife and a couple of the kids. Dickens, however, was sent to a friend's house, and he was put to work. This is a boy who was 12 years old at this time. He was taken out of school and put into service at a blacking factory. That's where they made shoe polish. It sounds terribly unhealthy, as a matter of fact, for a 12-year-old child. But that's essentially what he did, until somehow or other his father's debt was repaid and he was returned to school. He never went to the university, which is a fairly significant thing. A lot of his training as a writer was simply practicing and reading what other people actually did. As a young man, he became a reporter, and so he did a lot of practice of writing. And particularly, he wrote for the courts. So when he did Bleak House, I think he just kept all that court stuff that he wanted to dump on people when he was writing that novel. At any rate, he wrote under the pseudonym Boz, and some of you may associate Dickens with the name Boz. It was a name that he gave to his, a name that his brother had as when he was growing up. Dickens is one of the earliest successful novelists that I know of. He was 24 years old when Pickwick Papers was published, and he was an instant success. people were crazy about that particular book. And it was followed within a year or two by Oliver Twist, and that solidified the reputation that Dickens had among the readers of London. As time went on, his reputation went up and down a little bit, and I'll talk about that. But for the most part, at least among readers in England and in London, he continued to have the status, something like what we would give a rock star. People went to his lectures, people attempted to shake his hand, to touch him. I mean, it was a very, very strange situation that I think on the one hand he enjoyed, and on the other hand, his privacy was pretty well destroyed. The first of his novels, The Pickwick Papers, is a very loosey-goosey thing. It's got, its structure is very episodic. It's kind of travels of Mr. Pickwick and his servant, whose name was Weller. In that, and I'm not going to march through all 14, 15 novels. I'm going to pick out 2 or 3 that I want you to sort of keep in mind, again, because of what I'm going to do and try to do a little bit later. But one of the things that Dickens developed in Pickwick Papers, besides his ability to create characters, which everybody in here, I'm sure, is aware of, was a way of identifying characters by verbal tags. A lot of people who look down on Dickens as a novelist would argue that his characters are not dense, are not complex, and that too often he relies upon a verbal tag. I don't know whether you know what I mean by this, but a typical way that somebody speaks, and they say the same thing, and every time they do it, you can identify that. In the case of Weller, what he did was to create bizarre similes. I mean, just bizarre similes. And you just think to yourself, oh, that's Weller, and it just used again and again and again. And whether you like that or not is really a matter of taste, it seems to me. Oliver Twist was a book that was very interested in child labor, and Dickens was a social critic. You're going to hear a lot about this, I think, in everything that comes later. But he certainly was a social critic, aware of terrible things that were going on in England: child exploitation, child labor laws, problems with debt and with the penal system, with the courts and so forth. So he's very much aware of this. And most of his books, not all, but most of his books in this middle period are concerned with that in one way or another, but concerned with it in a comic context, so that you could care about these things, but you could still have a laugh at the beginning, and things would turn out okay at the end. Nickleby is another important book from this period, and it too, a little longer than some of the rest of them, was a satire on boarding school and children. And you'll notice that children and child characters become a sort of a major theme in a lot of what we're looking at here. Dickens published serially, and that was not unusual in the 19th century. What it meant is that instead of publishing the book when the author finished it, you would get a little, I don't know, a pamphlet about this. I'm going to show you pictures of that in a minute. But a little pamphlet that would contain 60 pages, apparently, of the novel. And you could pay a shilling for that and take it home. And then you would, when the next series came out, you pay another shilling, and you'd get the second part of it. And you would go on perhaps through as many as 12 different sets, and then eventually you would have the whole book. Now, there was a lot of useful aspects to this serial publication. The one useful aspect is from the point of view of the writer. You don't have to have the whole thing done before you can begin realizing money for your efforts. From the point of view of the reader, this was also useful because there was, it might be expensive, as much as £1, for example, to buy a fancy book. of Dickens, but you could put a shilling down this month and a shilling down 2 months later, do you see? And over time, people could begin to accumulate a book that they might not have wanted to put money into all at once. So serial publication, Thackeray did it, and many, many other people from the time. Then after a book became famous, what it was a common thing to do was to put the books together as a set. And again, I sort of encourage you to think about what your own experience was with this. From about 1850 on, in England and in America, it was very, very common for publishers to try to make money by sets of books intended for the bookcase. I can remember my own home, we had a set of Thackeray. I'm not sure many people ever read Thackeray, but we had a set of Thackeray. There was a set of Shakespeare, and there was a set of Dickens. And my dad liked Dickens, and so they were actually read. But it was one of the things that you did when you reached a certain level of education and a certain level of income, that you could buy some of these beautiful books. Many of them had gold stamping on them, and perhaps with a very fine picture of the author and so forth. As book designs, they weren't much because they were designed by the printer rather than someone outside. But these books were expensive, and the person who wrote the books, as long as they lived, could realize significant money from that particular thing. In all of this, Dickens managed to marry. He married a woman named Catherine Hogarth, and he had 10 children. I mention that only because, apart from the appropriate number of children for a Victorian family, it was also true that in the 60s, the 1860s, very close to the end of his life, which was in 1870, we would say had an affair, and I'm not sure that is quite the right way to talk about it. He discovered a soulmate. She was an actress. Oh my gosh. She was an actress by the name of Ellen Kernan. And the intensity of their relationship, the intimacy on a not physical level, but the intimacy in terms of soulmate kind of thing, was really very important. Still to this day, people don't know whether it was actually a physical affair or not. But the gossip very clearly said that it was. And the problem here is that it sullied the reputation of Dickens. Just at the time that he had this relationship with Ellen Kernan, he was beginning to make his tour of America, which some of you may know. He came twice to America with very different kind of responses on the 2 separate occasions. But he tried to arrange for Ellen Kernan to go on another ship to America to meet him there so that she would be there. And his wife had it, and so she moved out with the children. And from that point on, I think they were in contact with each other maybe 3 times by letter having to do with business. So it was, for all intents and purposes, the end of his marriage, and also a kind of an unfortunate twist to the direction that the kind of lionization of Dickens took. I want to mention 2 other books, and that one is David Copperfield, and the other is Great Expectations. And I happen to think that Great Expectations is his finest work. I think it has the best kind of balance of character and structure and plotting and interest in issues, but not being buried in those issues. And it is what's called a Bildungsroman, which is a German word for a coming-of-age novel. Lots of coming-of-age novels, and that's one of the reasons that children are or young people are sort of historically have been drawn to him, because he has all of these children. And in the case of Great Expectations and David Copperfield, you have this coming of age, somebody acquiring a kind of maturity that they would not have at the very beginning. And both of those, in that sense, are quite delightful books. I want to, I think I have to kill him off now. I'm saying that in 1870, Dickens died, and I think his death is rather interesting because one of the things he loathed about his contemporary society was the Victorian way of death. And I don't know what you know about that, but I remember seeing a Victorian picture once of a little boy in a white casket, and maybe some of you have seen these little lockets that have hair in them and various other kinds. Mark Twain takes that whole thing apart as well. But what I think that he was interested in is that he was not going to be buried in the Victorian way. And so he actually had a midnight burial. He originally just wanted to be buried in a little churchyard, and people wouldn't allow him to be buried in a little churchyard. So he was buried in Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey, but he was buried at night with a very simple ceremony and nobody around except a very few people that had been his friends. And then the next day, they left his grave open with the casket in it, and then the people could come and dump flowers and do whatever they want, and then they come and go. So I kind of like that about him, where all that other people admired him and saw him as the greatest living writer and so forth. He was modest enough in his final days and in the final arrangements that he simply did not want the grand state funeral that everybody would have thought that he would have had. So that's a little bit of what I think I might want to say about Dickens. And what I want to do now is to turn to talking about his reputation. And I'm interested in this in a couple of different ways. On the one hand, I'm interested in his critical reputation. That is sort of how critics have seen him then and how critics see him now and in between. But I'm also interested in readerly criticism. And what I mean by that, the people who admire someone's work and buy the books and read them. And so there's a difference between professional critics' view of Dickens and the kind of view that ordinary people who read Dickens have had all along. And those two things sometimes go in different directions. In his own day, Dickens' reputation fluctuated, as I've already suggested. Most of the time, the people who bought his books stayed with him and adored him. But from very early on, people who wrote reviews and people whose ideas about Dickens, about writers were admired, had their doubts about Dickens. For example, George Meredith, who I mean, some of you may know, a 19th century writer, George Meredith says about Dickens, and this is just shortly after Dickens had died, that he was a lightweight, his plots were implausible, he was aesthetically crude, a caricaturist rather than a creator of character, and with little intellectual challenge. Those things are the things that when people want to diss, as my students would say, when people want to diss a character, one or more of these things keeps coming up. However, there is still this resiliency of a reading public that is very, very important. And I guess, you pay your money and you take your choice, and it's the people who put money in the author's pocket that become important no matter what other people say. F.R. Leavis, he's that sort of a big gun 20th century critic talking about the novel, said about Dickens, the adult mind doesn't as a rule find in Dickens a challenge to an unusual and sustained seriousness. Well, right. At the same time you say this, there were people for whom the characters in Dickens were so alive that they moved outside of the novel. And this is very rare. There are not very many times that I can think of among writers where the characters in the piece become freestanding characters that people know quite apart from the book. One example would be Shakespeare, where people who don't read Shakespeare can recognize Hamlet, and the same thing with a lot of other characters. But Dickens was like this too. And I'm going to show you in a minute the way that actually worked out. But you have this constant tension between the sort of academic attitudes toward Dickens and the public, popular attitudes toward Dickens. It is not fair to say, however, that all academics have this attitude toward Dickens. There is a thing called, right now, called the Dickens Project, and it's a little bit like the Mark Twain Project and the Samuel Clemens Project, where it's a consortium of major universities, Yale, Iowa, places that are active in this kind of thing, that have done all sorts of things in publishing his letters and encouraging scholarly work on Dickens. So it certainly is not true that he has been deserted by academia, even though in my own experience, as I told you, it doesn't suggest that people are learning about Dickens from the schools. It's not coming through the schools. So where is it? And that's where I'm going to start showing my little pictures. I call this the selling of Charles Dickens, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I really want to emphasize that. But Dickens was a businessman. It's rare that you get artists who also have business savvy. And he was one of those people who could both create and write, but also knew how to turn that writing into something that people would buy and that would make him a reasonably rich man. From the very earliest time, Dickens was adapted for the stage. And I mean that. While he was still living, writing these books, his work was being adapted for the stage. So if we think of things like the Nicholas Nickleby musical or Oliver or whatever it is, if we think of that as sort of being a latter-day adaptation, it was in fact something that was going on from the very beginning and continued on through the 19th century, the late 19th century into the 20th century. So my first point is that Dickens has been sold to the American public, to the English public, by the stage-worthiness of the books. And what I mean by stage-worthiness is that in order for something to work on the stage, you need vivid characters, you see, and that's one of the things that he could do. And if those characters were a little thin, according to the critics, when you put a live, talented actor into that role, a lot of that thinness sort of melts away. So it's important for us to see that there has been and is a continuing tradition of awareness of Dickens through theatrical performances. And I'll show you some pictures from those in just a minute. Sometimes they've been serious plays, sometimes they've been musicals, but there they are. In our own, the next thing that I want to say about this is that it really helped Dickens that he was a writer for children, or that he was understood to be a writer for children. All of those young heroes would encourage children to read the books. And so you find, even though he's not perhaps in the curriculum of many schools, there are plenty of people who still have found their way to Dickens and have been delighted by the characters and the fairly rapid moving plots, if you will. Here's the point that I wanted to ultimately get at here. How did Dickens come to be Dickens? And what I mean by that, I could ask the same thing about how did Shakespeare become Shakespeare? And what I mean is, how did a living writer with strengths and with foibles become a cultural institution that moved over the centuries and that we still that still exists? And my argument would be that although part of it is the quality of his work, and I tried to address that, there is also an element of selling, of business, of making a business of writing that you can see in Dickens from his earliest time. He regularly gave lectures and readings, and his readings were extremely popular. What he would do is to take a scene, like the "May I Have Some More, Please" from Oliver Twist. If you happen to know that, you'll realize that that's a very moving kind of moment. And he would take these scenes and then he would read them dramatically. He would give dramatic readings, and he was pretty good at this, had people flocked to not only buy his books, but then to hear his readings. He did a version of his Christmas Carol that was shortened enough for him to do it in one reading. So there is a whole Dickens out there, do you see, that is part of the culture in a way that does not simply involve somebody buying a book like his and reading it. The next thing that I want to say is that there is an odd way in which Dickens came to represent Victorian England. If you can say about Shakespeare, the age of Shakespeare, and everybody knows we're talking about the late 16th century, you can do exactly the same thing with Dickens. The age of Dickens is going to be from about the 1830s through right up till the time he died and wrote that Edwin Drood, which was never completed. So it certainly is he was a part of London. There are plenty of books out there, and I Googled this in Amazon, when I tried looking through the Amazon. There are books about Dickens' London. It's a fascinating idea if you think about it, do you see? It's not just Dickens, but Dickens represents a particular way that people lived. And so the idea of him becoming a representative of an age is a rather important part of the selling of Dickens. You can still read a book about the age of Dickens and never have read one of his books, and it would still be a kind of an interesting thing. Next point I want to make about this business of selling Dickens is that he became associated with Christmas. That sounds like a trivial thing. It is not a trivial thing. I read one person who says that Christmas as we know it, and this was an Englishman, so I think he meant Christmas as celebrated in England. Christmas as we know it would have been different if it had not been for Dickens. The popularity of the Christmas Carol, and with it, Christmas customs, the gathering of people under certain circumstances, even the kind of food. There are a couple of different Dickens cookbooks, Christmas cookbooks, that kind of thing. Do you see the point that I'm trying to make? That there is a Dickens out there that is different from just simply the kind of thing that we would say if we were talking about Thackeray or if we were talking about something else. And that world, Dickens began to cultivate even while he was still alive, and clever businessmen have continued to do that right up into the 20th century. I guess I'm going to say that I think the other person who did this was Mark Twain, that Mark Twain was really able to sell himself as a lecturer. I mean, that white suit that he wore with his white hair, you see, and he became very much a cause célèbre in America, and had an important role in the publishing and distribution of his work. So I guess that's what I wanted to get at here. Right now, I want to have you see some pictures, and some of them will pick up some things that I have to. Whoa. I'll go back, see that handsome man. Not working for that. I put this picture here because it is so on Dickens. I mean, this is a very handsome fellow. I always think of Dickens as a sort of the author's cards Dickens, which is sort of an older Dickens, but he was not really showing through very well, is it?
We get the lights. We'll get it. Sorry.
Well, I don't know why. This is a completely lovely painting in full color, and I have not the faintest notion why it's not coming through, but nevertheless, there we are. This is the Dickens that we're more concerned with. I think the one in the corner is the author's card, Dickens. By the way, that notion of the author's card is part of the merchandising, isn't it? I mean, how many of us have learned about 19th century novels because we played author's cards when we were kids, and you could go right, in the most famous of his books, Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, and I think the fourth one is Great Expectations. I mean, those are really the most important books, and they're rather, they were also part of the author's card. This also is all washed out. This is actually a real nice color of green. And this was the way that his books were serially published. And in fact, one man made the comment that on the day that Mr. Dickens' serial book came out, that the street was papered green, suggesting that everybody was in a line there ready to pick up their particular version of the book. Now I'm going to say something else that I may offend you with, and that is that one of the elements that has been most important in preserving the reputation of Dickens and other people is classic comics. I sometimes ask my students about whether they have certain kind of information and whether they got it from classic comics, and more earlier on than right now. But the classic comics had a major role in establishing Dickens' reputation. These are some very, very early ones. My guess is, I tried to read the number, I couldn't, but maybe something like 1907, 10, something like that. The one on the side is uncomfortably close to my own childhood, but maybe a little bit earlier. And this one is a much more recent classic comic, and you see that the Oliver Twist, and there's other classic comics that I found on Great Expectations and Tale of the Two Cities. So the comics have been a force in establishing his reputation. I do believe that some students will read the classics and go on the classic comic, and later in life go on and read the book itself. Many will not, but there you are. Now, the new thing is the notion of the graphic novel. I don't know how much you know about that, but graphic novels are the new thing, and some of them are absolutely stunning. They are adaptations of classics, but instead of trying to be very, very true to the originals, there is more what we might call editorial space in the comics, and the way in which it's presented in terms of the way the book is designed is part of the appeal of classic comics. They're intended for students, but I find all the time that my college students have read, people will bring me classic, graphics novel on The Tempest. Oh, you got to see this. And for a long while I carried them in the back of my car and never looked at them. And when I finally got around to looking at them, I was stunned. I thought they were absolutely marvelous. The point I'm making again is that things besides just the reading of the novel maintain the reputation and the currency of the author. And I've got some more bizarre things than that if you want to. Here are some big little books and some advertisements for films, and Dickens is one of the most frequently filmed. There was something like, I think I read something like 600 different films from the very beginning, at the beginning of the 20th century, to now of different Dickens works. That's an enormous number. That's W.C. Fields playing Mr. Micawber. You see him there, and there's Oliver Twist looking pathetic. I put this in here because I like theater, and I thought this looks like a play I'm dying to see. It's Tale of Two Cities, and you can see what a really clever director, producer can do with a story when they put it on the stage. The visual of this is just absolutely magnificent. If you know Tale of Two Cities, it's about the French Revolution. You can see all that's caught here by the stunning color. Oliver, many people know. Great Expectations, the Utah Shakespeare Festival did a musical version that was fairly successful. All right, now, and this is my final point, I want to say that Dickens exists as objects as well as books. And I want you to see a little bit of the variety of objects. The first set of objects are very much what you would expect. the bust of Dickens, and there's busts of a lot of sort of famous 19th century men. And then the ubiquitous bookends of the author. Dickens here looking like, I think he looks like the bottom, but these are all different bookends that you can, even as we speak, buy on eBay. And then, this is called something like Project 56, and it is the beginning of collectibles. What it is a Victorian village that had all of these marvelous little images of houses, and they started as houses associated with Dickens, and then they've gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, and there are literally hundreds right now. You see that lovely little piece on the side there. On the other side is a series of characters that you could use to play out the Christmas Carol. These are all Christmas Carol. So if you want to collect things, you can collect Dickensiana, and a lot of it is going to include villages and imaginary London setting. So there's tons of this stuff available. And then Royal Doulton got into the act, and not just Royal Doulton, but Wedgwood and a lot of other of the great potters of England, and began creating images of Dickensian characters. And that really solidifies the point that I said, that the characters jump out of the book and they become sort of characters in their own right. Dickens is on the side there with his ink and his feather. But everybody who knows anything about Dickens will see that that is an Oliver Twist with his bowl asking for more, please. And it's really a very handsome piece of porcelain, as a matter of fact. Not all of them are handsome. A lot of them are really chintzy. Two here. The Artful Dodger, a very nice Royal Doulton. And on the other side, and I bet you've seen these in catalogs now, where they show all the different writers in these little pot-bellied images where you can take the head off and so forth. You can get one of Shakespeare, you can get one of Mark Twain, and so forth. But definitely you can get one of Dickens. Here's just more beautiful porcelain on the subject of Dickens. There's a water jug and a fruit bowl, and this is another water jug. And it would be fun to play the game of can you tell who that is. Some of these are really quite delightful. Look at that. These are all Dickensian things that is possible to buy. Now, those are very beautiful. You can go now to Tacky. Everybody's favorite, the platter on the manorial platter on the wall. The ones down in the corner are flow blue, and they're made by major English porcelain maker. The one up above there looks to me very much like something that I remember getting from Eagle Supermarket with your anyway, there's a whole set of those associated with Dickens. Plaques. Yeah, everything from wood down below to some kind of rosin at the top. And this is my example of absolutely the worst. Dickens snow globe, set of Dickens Denitass spoons, and the Dickens ornaments for your Christmas tree. So, I guess what I want to say is that I'd like you to give some thought to how you know about Dickens and how you got to be here for this occasion, you see. It would be interesting to know, and I won't embarrass anybody, how many people in here have actually read Dickens. That's pretty good. But you aren't exactly your average bear. And so I think that, but we all came to Dickens by strange, circuitous routes. I said that my first reading of Dickens was in the Olive Wolfer Miller book, but that isn't quite true. My mother had on a table there a series of Royal Doulton figurines. I can't remember. I know Weller was there and a little fat lady, and I'm not quite sure exactly who she was. But I remember asking my mother, what are those? And she said, oh, those are Dickens. So now, my first introduction to it is an object. That's Dickens. And now I've got to find out later who this man is and how it goes. So I guess Dickens is alive and well. The Guardian in England has taken charge of the 200th anniversary celebration, and they have an incredible array of things, everything from a wreath to scholarly conferences to dinners that, to celebrate Dickens and so forth. And so Dickens is alive and well, both in the objects of our popular culture and also, I think, in the minds and hearts of people who have read any of his books at all. Thank you.
Dr. Youngberg, would you mind taking the question?
I can answer Yes, sir.
When I was growing
This
up,
is my boss.
when I was growing up, everybody I knew, because we had the Scott Forsberg reader, had to read both, and I think in this order, Tale of Two Cities and then David Copperfield.
Yes.
Is that not done anymore?
No.
Apparently not.
No. And part of it is that there's so much new youth fiction that has just gotten nudged right out. And I mean, what that's going to mean in the future, realistically, I don't know. Because kids are not coming to college having read very many of those. But those
they don't come anymore reading any of the same books, right?
No.
I mean, you ask them what they had in English class, and it never gets the same answer.
They do a little bit better with Mark Twain and with American writers, because I think there's more emphasis on American writers now in the schools than there was back when I was in school. So, yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
Where does Dickens stand in terms of contemporary feminist?
There's what? Oh, feminist?
Feminist criticism.
Yeah. I think one of the disadvantages that Dickens has had in the university is that his women characters, female characters, are not strong characters on the whole. And so there's been comparatively little real interest. Wilkie Collins, who was one of his best friends, the feminists are fascinated by Wilkie Collins for a number of, I think, really complicated reasons. But feminists are not terribly interested in it, and that may also account for, the lack of interest at the university. Umi back there is going to tell us all about how post-colonial perspectives on Dickens, and that seems to me to be a very valid and interesting. The people who are interested in social criticism, do you see, Marxists and other people would find Dickens to be really interesting because there's a kind of socialist dimension to a lot of what he does. But not so much the women. Those of us who are females that have read them, there are very few female characters in Dickens' writing. That's my problem. When I first read about David Copperfield, I had there's possibility there that I that's just my own perspective. Yeah.
54 years ago, as a freshman in high school, I was forced to read basic education. Until this moment, I never realized why they were doing that, because I was bored to death.
Yeah.
But now I realize the intellectual maturity
Yes.
of a small town farm background, reading stories of a big, large city.
Yeah. Urban problems.
Urban problems, very complex, a whole other way of living, like you said, a maturing intellectual maturity
That's right.
that until this moment I never realized.
Yeah, and I think it's also possible to say that the English are more in love with Dickens than the Americans are. He has become so enshrined in England that if I were talking about a class that I had in England and asked all the same questions that I asked in my class, the results would have been different. I'm absolutely certain.
Right.
Yeah.
I enjoyed teaching Great Expectations many years ago.
Yes,
Anyway,
yes.
my question is, how did he die?
Natural death, I don't know. He had been working till very close to the end of his life, because that's the novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. And it's really, do you know?
But he did have gout, and I don't know, but when he started his public speaking and doing it, and that really wore him out, and his health is
Yeah. Yeah, I think he was writing very close to the time
When I
he
spoke,
does.
he was what, 68?
Yeah, that's also part of the cottage industry that is Dickens. How does Dickens' novel Edmund Drood live? How does it end? Is he alive or is he not? I mean, it's a really kind of a fun thing. And any number of people have suggested endings or actually written alternative endings, a little bit like they do with Jane Austen, isn't it? Lady Jane or something like that, where you've got how do you think it really ends? And that also continues the reputation, do you see? For sure.
What the dickens does this expression mean?
I didn't get it.
What the dickens does this expression mean? What the dickens?
I have no idea.
It was a, actually, it was
we were just waiting for somebody
it was
to say
a
that.
bit of a corruption on what the devil. And if that was too harsh for your pietistic, if that was too harsh for your pietistic family life, Dickens is a safer bet.
You're good.
The 1930s, the London Times put out the second Dickens one book a month that my father subscribed to.
Oh, yes.
We had a leather-bound book of one of Dickens' books come every month. And I was in my teens then. And so
Do you still have it?
when I came to the United States, I couldn't bring the whole set. So I bought 8 of them, and I'm still gone.
Yes.
But as he read them, so did I.
Well, you really have a different view on this than we have, do you see? Because he belongs to you more than he belongs to us from an artistic sense. I think that's true. How interesting.
Let's ask a question.
Was Dickens the first major celebrity of his time?
When I said rock star, I really meant it. It may be that Dickens and Oscar Wilde, he's the other one, not because of the grandeur of what he was doing, but because of this ability to dramatize himself and to sell himself. He seemed to have the ability to do this just as Dickens did. So, I mean, he was aware of his celebrity status and he cultivated it, but he also hated it. You know, that's the same thing that everybody says now, isn't it? That they really like being admired, but they want people to leave them alone, and it doesn't go with the territory to do for them to have. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, he's lived on 200 years they're celebrating. People were making pottery, porcelain.
Yes.
How did they protect? They didn't have copyright laws then.
No.
So what happens with the sale?
I don't know at what point, or even to what extent that there would be any copyright that would be functioning at that time, because I don't know what copyright laws are for England. Do you see, it would be different, and that would be in America.
Books, we're still buying
Oh, yeah.
paperbacks that are being made. and
Absolutely, absolutely, but they are out of copyright by almost all standards, I would think. It's an interesting question, you know, what's the limit of what you can do to these characters? There is a Dickens thing called Dickens Unzipped. I don't know what that is, and I know that there's a Shakespeare Unzipped, and I've avoided that too. But it does suggest that it's some kind of romp on Dickens, and you know, it's just like the satirist. You have a kind of a poetic license to do things like that.
That may be the subject for a future Frieze Lecture series. The Frieze Authors Unzipped. The good news is, friends, 2 things. Thanks to our friends at Theo's here in downtown Rock Island, we've got some wonderful treats for you where you can carry on the conversation in the gallery right next door. But this is not the end of our series. You ever wonder when a modern-day journalist drops in the word Dickensian? Well, they're not just talking about the works of Dickens, they're talking about a world. And next Tuesday, if you'll join us at 2 p.m., Dr. David Ellis from Augustana's History Department will tell us all about the world of Dickens. But for now, would you please join me in thanking our inaugural speaker, Dr. Conrad.